Welcome back to Music Appreciation. Today we begin Module 3, which goes into timbre, and we'll be talking about acoustic instruments. So this is 3.1, acoustic instruments. Let's take a look at what we'll be doing today. So as we begin Module 3 discussing timbre, we'll be talking today about acoustic instruments. So your assignment for next class is to continue reading from the Stolet Electronic Music Interactive. Now we'll be reading numbers 9 through 27. So remember to scroll down just like you did last time and hit next to get from one number to the next. We won't be covering every single detail from this on our quizzes, but it's great information and interactive. So this gets you ready for next time when we'll be talking about electronic music. Today we focus on acoustic instruments. So acoustic means, in this case, as opposed to electric or electronic. So acoustic meaning any physical object that creates sound that we consider an instrument, that's acoustic. So not just an acoustic guitar, but all instruments that are not electronic in nature we'll be discussing in detail today. What we'll be doing first is talking about timbre as it comes from instruments. Then just a very brief and general discussion of the history of instruments. Then organology, which is the study of classifying instruments and families of instruments. And then we'll talk about timbre briefly via instrumental techniques, and at the end we'll just point out a few strange instruments. So in the middle here, I'll be showing you some instruments I have around the house and talking about how we categorize and think about those instruments. So I hope you enjoy. So we're going to begin talking about instruments by listening to 15 instruments that I chose. A lot of these are orchestral instruments, so they're pretty standard in orchestras and bands. We're going to first start by just listening to them, and I'm going to show pictures so that you know what these instruments are. In the last lesson, we talked about what timbre is, and now we go further into what creates and is responsible for timbre. So we're going to look again at both the sound spectrum and the waveform up here. So remember that in the sound spectrum, we're seeing the frequencies in this bottom section here, throughout here. So these are high or fast frequencies and low frequencies. And then up here, we're seeing the waveform. So this is the oscillations in time. So we will be able to see both at once now, so you can see how they relate. What we're going to do is just explore these first 15 instruments, picked somewhat randomly, but also they're pretty well known mostly. So we have a flute, clarinet, so in order they're flute, clarinet, oboe, bassoon, French horn, trumpet, tuba, violin, cello, guitar, it's a classical guitar, piano, marimba, vibraphone, tie gong, and a synthesizer playing a square wave. So as we get into today's lesson, we're going to talk more about the types of instruments and what gives them these specific sounds. But first, we'll just explore hearing these different samples of performers playing these instruments. They're all playing the same note. So remember, if you want to think about what timbre is, think about all these different physical objects performing the same pitch. So in this case, it's middle C. Let's go ahead and listen, and I'll say the names of the instruments again before you hear them. Flute, clarinet, oboe, bassoon, French horn, trumpet, tuba, violin, cello, guitar, piano, marimba, vibraphone, tie gong, and synthesizer with a square wave. So we can see differences both in their waveforms and also in their spectra. So you notice some of them look rather similar and others look very different. Let's talk about what they look and sound like. Timbre, as we discussed last time, is something that we're very good at identifying the differences, but it can be hard to explain the differences, just like it's hard to explain what timbre is. It's this. It's all these different timbres of different instruments on the same note. So notice how, for example, here we see the guitar. We can describe its timbre both through the waveform and frequency spectrum. We can see that the guitar has a lot of frequencies, a lot of partials at the very beginning. Notice right here, we see a lot of vertical, so a lot of frequency partials. And we see a lot of them continue, but they die off as the bottom or the fundamental frequency continues on. The same is true with the piano right here. Insofar as a lot of the higher frequencies die off, but they're there at the beginning. So we notice that with these string instruments, we have a lot of harmonics or a lot of partials at the beginning. They die away, but the lower partials or harmonics continue on as the string continues to resonate. That's because the way that we activate those strings in the case of the guitar is by plucking, and in the case of the piano is by hitting them with a hammer, the little hammer inside the piano. So when they're first hit, we hear all this complex information from the string. We hear all the higher harmonics, but as it continues to ring, it's no longer being plucked. So we just hear the lower parts of the string. You don't need to remember those kind of details, but I do want to describe them to you. So again, just come back to this looks different than this cello, and that's part of the reason they sound different. So that phenomenon is called attack transients. You also don't have to remember that, but the attack transients are the harmonics that happen just at the very beginning of a sound. So we notice that guitar, piano, and all three of the percussion instruments work that way. We see them here as well in the waveform up here as having a very loud attack and then dying away. So that has to do with how we're hitting them as well, just hitting this percussion instrument. Notice how the vibraphone, for example, is a more extreme example of the attack transients. It is a piece of metal, and when it's hit, we hear a lot of sound right at the beginning, and then we hear a very, very long single note fundamental. The first two instruments, I'm going to zoom in on those. The first two were the flute here and the clarinet. Let's hear those again and look at the spectra. Some differences we can see are the clarinet here has louder partials on the odd numbers 1, 3, 5, 7, 9, where it has quieter partials, quieter harmonics on 2, 4, etc. Whereas the flute seems to be pretty equal in volume. Remember, the volume is the color, so these more red or darker lines are quieter than these yellow ones, which are very loud. And this program lets me isolate each harmonic, so we can just hear, if we want to, this. And we can hear how its second harmonic is quieter. Let's hear that again. Whereas with the flute, both are loud. So there's these differences in volumes between the harmonics, and that's one of the main things that contributes to the timbral difference. You will also notice some harmonics that seem to be missing or just extremely quiet, like this one here. We can hear it in the flute. It's pretty quiet, but here we don't hear anything. We hardly hear anything at all here. You can see that there's kind of a gap. So these absences or louder or softer harmonics or partials are part of the sense of timbre. You notice this noisy static in between here. That's the breath of the flute. So when we hear the flute sound, we know partly that it's a flute because we hear so much more breath coming through. So let's listen to that. I can't isolate each of these little segments in between the harmonics, but here's just one of them. It's a little bit like hissing. So you notice when the cleaner sounds like this has less breath in it because we see less staticky mush in between. So that was the oboe, and there's a lot less air that escapes when playing into the double reed of the oboe. We can compare a couple of these brass instruments. Whoops. This is the tuba, and this is the trumpet. So we hear a difference of timbre for sure. We notice that the tuba does have more breath escaping. This is also a lot higher in the range of the tuba, so it's harder to play. It's up high on the tuba. It's right in the middle of the range of the trumpet. So you can just see how there are many more clear harmonics in the trumpet than there are in the tuba. It's a smaller instrument. And again, I don't really need you to identify and point these differences out again, but just know that they're there, see how they work. When we hear the strings here, we notice a little bending of the pitch. This is a fingered note, so it's not an open string. They've got their finger there. As they bow, you can hear and see the pitch bend down. If you can see that, it sort of bends down this way. That's because at the beginning of the bow, the pressure is harder, and then it sort of levels out. we notice looking at the very end to the synthesizer that there's a clear missing harmonic scheme that's going on. All of them have the fundamental, the bottom harmonic. As we go up the harmonic series like this, you can see all the ones that do and don't have the second harmonic, the third harmonic, the fourth harmonic, and the fifth harmonic. You notice a pattern over here with the square wave. The square wave synthesizer has a pattern of harmonics 1, 3, 5, 7, etc., all the odd harmonics. It's often compared to a clarinet because, looking back again at the clarinet, it has louder harmonics on 1, 3, 5, 7 than it does on the odds. It still has the evens. The odd ones are louder. The evens are still there, but they're quieter. So the differences of timbres could be described acoustically as being a difference in the volume of the harmonics, a difference in the way that they sound at first versus as they sustain, or what's known as the attack transients versus the sustain, the amount of air or noise that's in between the harmonics, the way that the harmonics subtly move or vary. Some of these you see a little bit of vibrato, others are more pure and straight. Taking the example of the vibraphone, this piece of metal is just very, very pure and straight here. Whereas you can see in this piano, there's a little bit of variation to the volume of some of these harmonics. You can see this one dipping in and out, and that's just part of what creates the sense of timbre. And just notice again, finally, that the synthesized sound is very perfect, pure, and unchanging, and that's part of what gives it its characteristic sound. Last note on these, I mentioned before that metal objects can have partials that are not harmonically related. Another way of saying that is, notice how the tie gong, this is the tie gong, let's hear it again. We do hear the pitch of the tie gong. You can see that it has the first harmonic. It also has the second harmonic. Then it's missing a lot in this range. But then up here it has what appears to be the sixth harmonic, but then some other partials in between. So metal objects, just especially strangely shaped ones, can have other types of partials. We can isolate and just hear this. It's kind of a metallic ringing. So now that we've seen some standard instruments and some of their spectral qualities, let's go back and talk a little bit about a general history of instruments throughout time. So, as you might guess, instruments date back into prehistory and way, way back many thousands of years. And as they've developed, the same types of early instruments kind of turned into our modern categories of instruments that we're going to be talking about right after this. So there is no definite history of instruments and what came first, but we do have some individual examples that have been found in archaeological digs that we can use as some signposts along the way. So I won't be giving a breakdown of a timeline, but I will just be giving some highlights. I would say that probably the first instrument was the voice. As long as animals, including humans, have made vocalizations, we've been able to sing. One way to describe singing would be to say that it's just a sustained sound that we can make with our voice. So rather than a yip or a bark or a yell or a word, it's a sustained sound. So possibly even yelling from a mountaintop could count as singing. And of course, we used our voice to mimic other sounds as well. So beyond just the voice, the first external instruments to the body would have included flutes and drums. And we have some examples, including the Divyababe flute, which I find really fascinating. This flute was found in what is now modern day Slovenia, and it was found in a cave which was inhabited by early humans. There's some debate as to whether the humans that made this flute were Neanderthals or Cro-Magnons, which were the early modern humans. So I think that's pretty cool too. This difference of species. We don't know which species actually made this. So the Divyababe flute is a 43,000-year-old flute made out of the leg bone femur of a cave bear. So the oldest existing instrument that we have from ancient times, from 43,000 years ago, was made out of the bone of an animal that doesn't even exist anymore. A cave bear is a prehistoric, very, very large bear that, of course, lived in caves. And this human living site that was found in Slovenia was a home probably to both cave bears and these prehistoric humans. So the bone is carved with two holes and was blown into, probably like a modern flute. So it maybe had three notes. And that is the same basic design of modern flutes and all the flutes in between, where there's a pipe and holes. And by pressing down on the holes, you're increasing the length of the pipe that is where the airflow is. So with the holes open, the air flows in between the mouthpiece and the first hole. With the holes down, it flows from the mouthpiece to the bottom of the last hole. So they're presumably drums that were created in these very, very early times as well, including slit drums or log drums, which are basically a log with a little slit in it. And so when you hit this near the slit, it creates a somewhat pitched sound. And modern drums descended from earlier drums, which were all made from animal skins stretched over a medium. In a moment, we're going to be talking about the types of instruments, and a drum is a membranophone, meaning it's a stretched membrane. So there were presumably drums, although those have decomposed. Other early instruments that we've found include bull roarers. There are examples of bull roarers from at least 18,000 years ago. And interestingly enough, they were invented in Europe, Asia, Africa, and Australia separately. And what these do is they cut through the air as you whip them around. It's basically a plate or some piece of wood that you whip around on a string. And as that piece of wood cuts through the air, it makes a roaring sound. So it's kind of similar to when you move a sword or a pointing device or some kind of a whip through the air. We hear the air being cut quite literally through the air column. And it's a little bit similar to the way a flute works, where it cuts through the air by blowing over a sharp edge. So whipping something through the air does create a kind of simple instrument. So other early instruments would have included a musical bow, a very simple string that's being bowed, and a jaw harp, which is a little piece of metal or something else that you put in your mouth and move your mouth around and play this one note. It's kind of like a single note thumb piano. Ancient Egypt, we know, was a home to a lot of early cultural advances. And so ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia both reveal a lot of their musical instrument developments through images. So we know that there were instruments because we have these existing pieces of art that show ancient Egyptians and Mesopotamians playing these instruments. That includes a sistrum, which is basically a metal rattle, and that was used both in Egypt and in the country of Georgia. and also in by the Yaqui people in Mexico, um, basically a rattle. So ancient Egypt also had vertical flutes, so pipe flutes and double clarinets. So a single reed instrument with two sides, and drums and harps. So all of these early instruments after the flute came around about 5,000 years ago. So we've had about at least a 5,000 year history of real instruments as we know them being played, which is quite a long time. About 4,000 years ago, it seems that the lyre shows up, which is a harp. We also see the invention of the oboe and trumpet, early versions of those. In Israel, we see from about 4,000 years ago the use of a frame drum, which I'll show a little later on, um, and also pipes, and a trumpet like instrument called the hasorsra. I don't know how to say that. And then the shofar, which is a ram's horn that you just blow into. It's essentially a simple bugle made out of a ram's horn. Um, then in Greece, about 3,000 years ago, we see major developments in instrument making, including the double reed and the double reed, so two double reeds played at once, connected together. And the Greeks also made large advances in thinking about the math of music, the tuning systems that we'll talk a little bit about soon, including just intonation tuning systems based on simple math. So a string with the length of 5 versus a string with the length of 4, which is also related to the harmonic series. The Greeks, about 3,000 years ago, made big advances in thinking about different tuning systems. The xylophone is worth mentioning. The xylophone is like the marimba that we just saw, but it's pieces of wood cut to different lengths, and then each one has a different note. They're a very early instrument, especially in Asia, where they cropped up a few thousand years ago, and they also came in Africa about a similar time. And there's debate as to whether the xylophone was brought by Melanesian immigrants from Asia to Africa, or if it was developed separately in Africa. In China, we see the development of the zither, which is a harp with a lot of strings, all tuned to different notes. And also Asian music then and continuing into now, it involved a lot of what we'll call idiophones in a minute, which are solid pieces of an object with a solid resonating body, so like a bell or a chime. So we'll talk a little bit about gamelan music, which comes from Indonesia. In fact, one of our listening examples from Radio Yogyakarta involves some gamelan music in the early part of that example, which is an orchestra made from all metal, what are called metallophones, like the vibraphone that we saw, metal bars tuned by shortening and lengthening the length of the different bars. So a big orchestra of all metal instruments like that. So that's called gamelan music, and it's from Indonesia. About 2,000 years ago, or a little more, the Celts in Ireland and around there had an interesting instrument called the cairnix, which was used for intimidation in battle. It's basically a trumpet that has the end carved into an interesting looking screaming animal, and it makes a loud wailing sound. And about 1,000 years ago, the Byzantine lyre in the Byzantine Empire became basically established the ancestry of the violin. And we start to see the ancestors of the guitar cropping up about 1,000 to 2,000 years ago. And right around that time, basically 1,000 years ago, so 1000 AD, that's when most of the predecessors of modern instruments came about. So we see bagpipes and trumpets and trombones and guitars and um, lutes and lyres and all of these things. And more interesting instruments like the hurdy-gurdy, um, an instrument that you crank and the wheel turns against a string and you press keys to play, changing the length of the string. Um, uh, and many, many other types of instruments with all kinds of names from everywhere. So think about the last 1,000 years or so, really the blossoming of the rest of our instruments. So just as a review, basically the earliest instruments were the voice and the flute and drums, and then that sprang into other wind instruments like early clarinets, and string instruments like lyres and zithers, and all of that kind of developed into the instruments that we know now. So next we're going to talk about how we categorize instruments, both past and present, from all over the world. So the study of the categorization of instruments is called organology. The most famous and most followed system of organology is called the Hornbostel-Sachs system. It's kind of like the Dewey Decimal System. It's a way of categorizing things that involves numbers, but it's thought highly of, at least traditionally, because it's one of the only systems of categorizing instruments that actually allows for instruments from all over the world to be categorized, whereas other systems can have shortcomings and gaps where they can't describe something. So the Hornbostel-Sachs system is broken down into 5 basic types of instruments. And the key to thinking about this system is it's focused, at least on the largest level, on what is making the sound. So it's not as much about what is being played or how it's being played, but what is making the sound. So to give an example, a piano has keys that we play, but what's actually making the sound is strings. So piano is a string instrument in this system. So we're going to learn these 5 terms. They involve, they all end in phone, which is the Greek word for sound. So the first one is idiophones, then membranophones, chordophones, aerophones, and electrophones. So those first 4 are acoustic instruments we'll be focusing on today. The last one, electrophones, allows for electronic instruments like the synthesizer. So first up is the idiophones. So with an idiophone, you have the body of the instrument itself making the sound. So if we take an example of Kalimba or a thumb piano, it is an idiophone because it has little metal pieces that are actually what vibrates. Some more examples of idiophones would be cymbals. It's a piece of metal. The cymbal itself is what vibrates and creates the sound. A gong, a tube, a bell, any of these things that you strike or resonate, and the thing itself is what vibrates, so it's an idiophone. The second category is membranophones. That is essentially drums. So that means that it's a membrane. So a membrane can be an animal skin or a piece of plastic or a piece of paper, something that's stretched tight across usually a frame, and it vibrates through being hit or activated in some other way. So examples of membranophones would be any type of drum, hand drum, frame drum, snare drum, kick drum, bongos, anything like that. And then I'll get to another example in a bit. So just think of idiophones are objects that vibrate in and of themselves, like a bell. Membranophones are membranes, so drums. And then number three is chordophones, and that is stringed instruments. So chord means string. So chordophones would include all string instruments, no matter how you play them. So violin, cello, but also plucked stringed instruments like banjo, guitar, mandolin, zither. Any type of vibrating string is going to be considered a chordophone. So piano, koto, lutes, anything like that, a harp. And then the fourth category is aerophones. So that means that it's the air that's actually vibrating, and the instrument controls or creates the vibration in the air. So that would mean all, both woodwind and brass instruments are all part of aerophones. So the bull roarer that we talked about, whipping around through the air, is an aerophone. A whip, an organ has pipes that air moves through. So a pipe organ is an aerophone. An accordion, harmonica, any type of flute, oboe, clarinet, tin whistle, ocarina, saxophone, oboe, bassoon, and sirens. Natural trumpets like a didgeridoo or a shofar, a bugle, natural horn, any of those things, trombone. So these are just larger categories that speak to what is vibrating and what is the source of the sound. We know that there are some interesting crossovers where you might, for example, use your voice to activate an instrument, but the instrument has strings in it or something like that. For example, you could take a snare drum and sing really loud next to it, and the snare drum will sympathetically resonate, but the snare drum is still a membranophone. So the fact that I used my voice or some air, or if I blew on it, that would not make it an aerophone, because the thing that's vibrating and creating the sound is still a membranophone. So remember those: idiophones, membranophones, chordophones, and aerophones, and then finally electrophones, which we'll get more into next time when we talk about electronic music. Electrophones would include synthesizer, theremin, feedback, any type of computer instrument, but the sound is created by electrical means. So now to move on, within that, I want to talk about the families of instruments that we commonly know. So if you've ever played in a wind ensemble or a orchestra, you know about the families of instruments. So I said that the aerophones, for example, involve both the brass and woodwind instruments, but we make a distinction within aerophones of those two categories. So I want to just talk briefly about how each of those works, and then I'm going to demonstrate some instruments. So if we think about the orchestra, the 15 instruments that I showed a minute ago are some, but not all, of the instruments played in an orchestra. And if we listen back to those now, we can talk a little bit about how they work. So I'm going to briefly talk about the families of instruments, play a few examples, and then I will show some instruments that I have around. So if we think through the orchestra at the top of the orchestral score, the notated music, we have the woodwinds. So it starts with flute. So a flute is an aerophone, and it works by cutting through the air. So when we blow into a flute, there is a sharp edge to the flute that cuts our airstream and creates the sound by isolating the airstream into the length of the pipe. So we sort of force the air to follow the shape of the pipe, the flute pipe, And as we press down keys or holes, what we're doing is lengthening and shortening the length of the pipe. When all the keys are pressed down, the length of the pipe is from where we blow to the very end. And when no keys are pressed down, the length is from where we blow to the first hole. So that is how the category of flutes work. So within the larger category of woodwinds, woodwinds is kind of a deceiving name because it includes flutes, which are not made of wood, and saxophones, which are not made of wood. But we can just think about them as the woodwinds family, and that includes flutes, oboe, clarinet, bassoon, saxophones, and their cousin instruments. So let's listen to the clarinet again. So the clarinet is a single reed instrument. Like the flute, we're cutting through the air column, but instead of cutting through it by blowing onto the rim of the pipe, we're blowing onto a reed, and it's a wooden reed, usually wooden, that cuts the air, and then same thing with the length of the pipe and the keys. It changes the size as we press down keys. So flutes, no reed. Clarinet is a single reed. And then we have the double reed instruments. It's the oboe, and that's the bassoon. In between them, there's what's called an English horn, but a double reed instrument also cuts the air, but in this case, it is using two reeds pushed together, sort of like lips. So the two reeds go together and they vibrate together. So you're changing the aperture of the distance between the two reeds to create the buzzing sound that goes into the length of the pipe. So flutes, and then single reeds like clarinet, double reeds, which include oboe, bassoon, and English horn. So that's a horn. That's a trumpet. And that's a tuba. So now this brings us into the brass category, which is up next in the orchestra. So the brass are also aerophones, but instead of cutting an air column, the sound is produced by buzzing the lips. So the same way that you would prepare to play a brass instrument, you would warm up your lips by doing that. I'm not that good at it, but that's what you do. You buzz your lips together, kind of like you're making an elephant sound. And then what you're actually doing is, with that source sound, you're funneling that into a length of pipe, so a length of brass. And within that, the pitch that you are buzzing activates harmonics of the length of brass. So I'll talk a little bit about this again when I show the trombone in a minute. But the vibration starts with the buzzing of the lips versus with the flute and oboe and clarinet, where you are just forcing air over a reed. So brass instruments are pretty fascinating because they use the harmonic series that we've seen in action in the spectrum. We've seen all the stacked harmonics. When you play with a single fingering or a single position on a brass instrument, you buzz tighter or looser, and therefore higher or lower, and you activate another harmonic up or down in the harmonic series. But for our purposes, we can just think of brass instruments as buzzing lips into a very long length of pipe. Next up is the bowed strings. So we have the violin here, and the cello, and in between them is the viola, and below them in pitch is the double bass. All of these are stretched strings, so they're chordophones. So we've finished up with the aerophones in the orchestra, now we're on to the chordophones. So the chordophones are any string. In the case of bowed strings, that's our family. So we had the woodwinds, brass, and now we have the bowed strings. The bowed strings, as you might know in an orchestra, there are 50 of them sitting on stage because the instruments are naturally relatively quiet compared to brass instruments. Um, they can be very loud, but they're usually in a group to sort of beef up the sound. Um, so there's the way chordophones work, or string instruments, is it's a stretched string. So if you've ever put a rubber band by your ear and flicked it, you can hear that pitch. It's probably relatively low. If you tighten the rubber band, the pitch goes higher. The string tension is higher. The way that all string instruments work is they require the string to be held very tight. That's why it's a little bit hard to make your own string instruments unless you have some good winding gears. So it's also probably one of the reasons why they developed a little bit later in the history of instruments, because it can be very difficult to tighten a string well enough. So a bow that might have been used for hunting is theorized to be one of the earliest stringed instruments. It's called a musical bow because by stretching the string with the arch of the bow, you can create a single stringed instrument. Um, so the bowed strings work with a bow made of horsehair, which has rosin on it to make it sticky, and you move the bow across the strings, making the string move. And so, of course, you can sustain a note with a bowed string in the way you can't by just plucking the string. And that brings us to some other chordophones, like the guitar, which isn't always in the orchestra, but of course is one of the most popular instruments. So there we hear a classical guitar, and the classical guitar is has the same tuning and design as an acoustic or electric guitar, but the strings are a little farther apart, and it uses nylon strings. So that's kind of like a plastic string. It has a little softer of a sound. At least it uses nylon on the top higher strings. The lower strings are usually wound metal. So we hear kind of a softer tone when we hear a classical guitar. And guitar uses frets, which I will show in a minute. And then the piano, which we all know pretty well, is a huge range of stretched strings. And when we hit the keys of the piano, we're activating a little hammer that shoots up or down and hits the string to activate it. The middle and high strings of a piano, or keys of a piano, have three strings tuned to the same note. Every time you hit one key, there's three strings in there just to make it louder and more resonant. The low mid range has two strings, and then the very lowest notes only have one string. Now let's think about the percussion section. So that would be next up. So percussion is a family of instruments that involves two sides. One is pitched percussion and one is unpitched. So pitched percussion, like the marimba and vibraphone and tai gong that we heard, have a distinct pitch, whereas the unpitched percussion are like a snare drum. It doesn't have a clear pitch, but it's useful for making rhythm, obviously. So the percussion instruments have a huge variety of how they fit into the hornbostel sax system, whereas the ones we just talked about all fit in very clearly to a category. The woodwinds and brass are definitely aerophones. The pluck strings and the piano and the harp and all the bowed strings are definitely chordophones. But with the percussion section, if you are a percussionist, you play a lot of different things that are in multiple categories. The primary category is the idiophones, so the category one. Because, for example, the marimba and the vibraphone and the tai gong are all idiophones, because there's an object that is struck and it is vibrating and creating our sense of, or it's creating the resonance and the sound. So most of them are idiophones. That includes gongs, and bells and wind chimes, tubular bells. Let's see, all the keyboard percussion instruments, which are marimba, vibraphone, celesta, um, balafone, um, and most toy pianos. But then, of course, the percussion family also includes membranophones. So they're the where we find the membranophones in the orchestra as well. So the membranophones are, of course, the drums, and we know that everything from timpani to a bongo and a snare drum are all membranophones. So the percussion mostly fits into those two categories. There are some percussion instruments that involve strings, but they're played in a percussive way. So the families of instruments in the orchestra that we just went through: woodwinds, brass, bowed strings, plucked strings, and percussion are more categories of the sound and type of instrument and how they're played, whereas the hornbostel sax is the larger system that talks about what is vibrating. So, for example, percussion is mostly a category that says what you're doing. You're hitting things. Some of those things have pitches, like the marimba. Some of them just make a loud sound, like a cymbal. So, um, the the description of the percussion family is mostly about the action of hitting things. Um, okay, so now I'd like to go ahead and demonstrate just a few instruments for fun that I have around. This is a pretty random assortment, but it'll give us some examples of all of these things. So, of course, the guitar is a chordophone, a string instrument. So it is built with frets, so it's a fretted string instrument. The frets are not only markings of where the note divisions are, but they're also little pieces of metal that stop the string. So when you play an open string, you hear the whole length of the string from the bottom to here. When you fret a note, you're changing the length of the string. So now the string length goes from here, the bridge, to this metal line. So that means that you can play anywhere in this fret and you'll still be having the same string length because the fret itself is actually what stops the string. So you can be a little inaccurate about where you play in the fret. And also, it makes a clean sound because the fret, the piece of metal really stops it precisely, more so than your finger. So we all know what the guitar sounds like. And of course, you can tune it all sorts of different ways, and there are bigger and smaller guitars like baritone guitar, which goes lower, 7-string guitars, 12-string guitars, which have doubled strings, etc. This is a rather unique instrument. It's called a bowed psaltery. So a psaltery is another name for a zither. So you can see there are strings here. And there's 33 strings on this version, and it has a sound hole. But instead of plucking the strings, what you do with a bowed zither is to bow them. And unlike a violin where we're fingering the different notes, here we just, like a zither, play specific notes. And it's really clever how this is designed. This one was made right here in Asheville. These pins hold the ends of the strings, so in order to play the different notes, you just play between the correct set of pins. So to go up the scale, you actually go this way, because these are the long strings that start here. So to discuss brass instruments, I have this trombone that I got for really cheap at a thrift store. I'm not really a brass player, but it's fun to mess around with, so I'm sure many of you could speak a lot more on how to play it well or whether I put it together right. But this is a trombone, so all brass instruments work a similar way insofar as the splitting of the airstream is coming from the lips themselves. So when we buzz our lips to practice for playing this, like the do kind of an elephant sound, That's the same thing you do right into this mouthpiece. Um, and so what's happening is that buzzing of your lips is going to interact with the length of the brass tubing. Um, so if you think about what this is, actually what it is a long, long tube that's just been twisted around so that we can hold it in one place. This would be maybe, I don't know, 12 feet long if we flattened it all out. And that's where they come from. The original horns, like the shofar, the Israeli ram horn that you blow into, or after that, the alpenhorn from the Alpine mountains. It's just one very, very long straight tube that you blow into. So they came up with these ways of making curved brass instruments so that we can hold them and still play very low, because the longer the length of tube, the lower we play. So of course trombone has the slide, and what the slide does then is to lengthen the tube and thus lower the pitch. The other main element of brass instruments is that we are working with the harmonic series. So I mentioned the harmonic series in the last lesson. So if we think about keeping, in this case, the trombone in one position and not moving the slide, we can play a series of notes up and down. That's the harmonic series. What they are the different harmonics or partials of that single length of tube. Another way of saying that is that length of tube, or half, 1/3, 1/4, 1/5 length of that tube. With a trumpet or a valved instrument like a tuba or trumpet, you press a valve that activates a different section of the tube or deactivates a section of the tube, thus lengthening or shortening the tube length. Here's a little bit of my attempt to play at the harmonic series. I'm not very good at it, but that was harmonics 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. So that's kind of cool. It's all the different notes that happen in one place. So if we move the slide down, we've changed the overall length of the tube, and then you'd hear that same thing down a half step. So some examples of aerophones where the air is actually making the sound. So this is called a shvi, and it is just a type of straight flute or vertical flute. So you blow in the mouthpiece, obviously here, and then what happens is the airstream is split over this little blade, and it's so simple. All it is just basically a sharpened area here. They just took a knife and went whoosh. So there's just a little thin piece of wood there, and as your air goes over it, it splits the airstream and creates the sound. So then we change the length of the pipe that is producing the sound by closing these holes. So they're not like keys on an instrument that change something about its nature. They just cover up, and so the length of the air column is going from here to wherever the last hole is covered. So the length of pipe right now is from here to here, and if I cover this hole, then it's this. So more holes covered equals a longer wavelength, and so a lower note. Similar to that is the classic recorder. This is also an aerophone, and it is a duct. It's technically called a duct, or I think it's called a fipple. So there's just an area that you blow into here, creates this duct. It's really the same system as this. It's just that there's like a duct here, a little passageway for air that is before that. So basically you can hold it in your mouth a little bit more freely. And so this is a clarinet, standard B-flat soprano clarinet. Like many of the instruments from the orchestra or band, there's a whole family of each one. So there's a bass clarinet that's an octave lower than this. There's a sopranino clarinet that's a little shorter and is a fourth higher than this. There are some really fun giant ones, the contralto and the contrabass clarinet, which are huge. The same is true with saxophone. And it's very similar, saxophone and clarinet. There are a few major differences, but they both work similarly in that they are a long length of wood. In this case, with the saxophone, it's made of brass. But they have keys, so holes and keys. All of the keys just uncover and recover holes. So you can think about it as more of a complex system of holes with all of these keys that are located conveniently to change those holes as we press these keys. It's been a while, and this thing hasn't gotten out. Those reeds from high school. So this is a single reed. So we talked about double reeds and single reeds. The double reeds are two reeds together. This is a single reed. It's a wood, very thin piece of reed that sits on the mouthpiece. So we're cutting through the airstream with a wooden reed. And that's one of the main timbral differences between single reeds, double reeds, and the metal reeds of the accordion, etc. The timbre is coming from what is the physical substance that is cutting through the air. This instrument is also an aerophone, but it's a reeded instrument instead of a flute. So this is a double reed. So that means that there is a reed on top here touching a reed on bottom. So it looks basically like a U shape or like a circle, but it's technically a reed pressed up to another reed. You can see that, so this is a Duduk. It's an Armenian instrument. It's one of my favorite instruments. You can see that the pipe looks similar to a flute, but again, the air column is being split by the reeds, not by a opening in the pipe. So this one is a little bit more difficult to play because this double reed is very wide. The sound of this instrument is often compared to clarinet, and it's a little bit like the voice as well. The other time that you see really wide reeds is if you have ever blown in a duck call. It's a little similar. The reason it's difficult to play is because it takes an incredible amount of air. It just takes way more air than, say, the recorder. So people who are really good at the Duduk will learn to circular breathe. And if you don't know what circular breathing is, that's where you are constantly blowing out and you never stop. And the way that you're able to do that, I can't do it, so I can't show you, but maybe one of you can show us. The way that you do that is by blowing out as you normally would into the instrument, and then there's a moment where you breathe in through your nose while you're blowing out air stored in your cheeks, basically. So you breathe in through your nose while you're blowing out with your mouth. It's very impressive, difficult to do, and people who can do it can theoretically play for a really, really long time. So this is a double reed. Other examples of double reeds are oboes, bassoons, shawm, shanai, English horn. And that was the Duduk. This is called a bowron. It's a drum, so it's a membranophone. It's a Celtic version of what's called a frame drum. So frame drums are handheld and come in all different sizes, and they have a frame that holds this piece of wood in place, and then you stretch the skin over it, and then the skin on most or any drum, especially hand drums, was traditionally adjusted by adding heat. So you would hold carefully over a fire, and that would tighten the drum, the membrane, and that would make a higher pitch. So you can also press into the drum like I'm doing there. So another type of guitar is a guitar without the frets. So this is just a guitar where I removed the frets and then sanded it down. So now there's only markings for where to play, but not actually a fret that stops the string. So that's much more common in bass. If you know Jaco Pastorius, he's famous for playing fretless bass, just like an upright bass is fretless. Guitar is a little harder because the strings are closer together, so you have to be pretty creative about how to keep them ringing. So the advantages are you can play any note, any microtonal note, and you can slide between notes. But some of the disadvantages are possibly that the notes don't last quite as long as when there's a metal fret stopping it. And they can sound a little weaker and plunkier. And then, of course, it's hard to tune. That's part of the fun. So, fretless guitar. This is a Kalimba, also known as an imbira. So this is an idiophone. It has little tongues or little metal tines that are what produce the sound. There are better and bigger ones than this, but this is a kalimba, so it's idiophone, metal tines, played with the thumbs. Kazoo is a rather funny instrument, which is not quite what it appears. So we all know how to play it, but it seems like it's a wind instrument. It seems like an aerophone, but actually nothing happens when you blow into it. There's no reed, there's no blade to cut the air. So actually what it is a membranophone. It's a strange case. So it's in the same category as drums. It's a membrane, which is just a little stretched piece of plastic in up here, and you activate it with your voice. So you sing into it, and it sympathetically resonates with your voice. So whatever note that you sing, becomes and you hear that sort of buzzy, rattly thing. So the kazoo is actually a funny case. Here's another chordophone string instrument. It's the mandolin. So the mandolin is tuned just like a violin, so it's tuned much higher than a guitar, and it has 8 strings, but they're in groups of 2, and those are called courses. So it's 4 courses, which are tuned just like the violin, G, D, A, E, G, D, A, E, and each group is a group of a unison, so the same note. So it's just 2 strings that play the same note. Makes it a thicker, fuller sound. The frets are very close together, so it's rather hard to play in that way. But it's usually used for bluegrass, country music, often strummed like this. Or played with a tremolo. Tremolo is a very fast articulation. So it's a fun instrument. They also make, with the same family, larger instruments. So this is the mandolin, like the violin, and then there's the mandola, which is tuned like the viola, and even bigger than that, which I've always wanted to play, is the mandocello, which is tuned like a cello, even bigger than a guitar, but with 2 strings per course, and it looks and is shaped like this. So it's the mandolin. This is what's known as a melodica. So it's like a harmonica, but it's a melodica. It is more similar possibly to an accordion. It is an aerophone that uses reeds. So harmonica, accordion, and melodica are all aerophones, so it's the air that makes the sound. But just like how in the flutes we split the airstream with a reed, these have reeds. In all 3 of those instruments, they're metal reeds. So there's metal reeds in a harmonium, melodica, harmonica, and accordion. So this is the melodica. They're pretty cheap too if you want to buy one. If you play keyboard, it's fun to be able to play with your air. So it just has an air hose. So melodica. So these are another type of drum. These are called rototoms. So toms are the middle drums in a drum set. And these rototoms were developed in the 70s or 80s. They became very popular in the 1980s when drummers wanted to have an infinite amount of drums to play, and you can tune them really fast, which is why I like them. I think they're great. So what you can do is spin them, and what's happening is it's tightening the membrane on top, so it's tightening the drum head. Tune them to the notes of a song, or you could just kind of play around with them. Those are called rototoms, another membranophone. This is a shovel guitar. People make guitars out of a lot of different things. You've seen probably cigar box guitars before. This one's kind of fun. It's just a solid metal shovel, but it has cabinet handles to hold the strings as a bridge. It has a pickup. And then it has some guitar tuners at the top, and the strings don't actually touch this, so I play it with a glass slide, and it works pretty well for bluesy stuff. You could mark where notes are. I've marked mine in just intonation, so there's some different type of notes there. This is a toy piano, which is a group of instruments, any kind of small piano instrument. You can hear it here. It actually has, if you can see there, little metal tines or long pieces of metal that are cut to different lengths to make the different notes. So instead of strings, these are solid pieces of metal. So that would make this an idiophone and not a chordophone. It's a pretty fun little instrument. This one has a built-in pickup. This is a zither, or what's called a chord zither. So it's just individual strings that are tuned to one note. You don't change them, you just pick which ones to play. This one's designed to have little chords down here. So a along with what instrument you're playing, the other major element that affects the timbre of a sound is how you play the instrument. So, um, obviously, any instrument can be played in a number of ways. Some are much more versatile than others. The guitar, this guitar has a different kind of tuning, and it has all skinny strings right now. The guitar can obviously be plucked with fingers, it can be strummed, but it could even be bowed. So I wanted to demonstrate the bow. I don't have any traditional stringed instruments, but many things can be bowed. And so a guitar can be bowed, or any stringed instrument can be bowed. On a bowed string instrument, a normal one like violin or cello, the strings are arched this way, so they can play one string, move the bow this way, and be playing on another string or two strings at a time. In this case, since they aren't arched, they're flat this way, flat this way. It's harder to isolate the strings, so we kind of would normally bow them all at once. That could make a nice background track for a song. But many other things can be bowed as well. The bow is a way of creating friction with very, very tiny little irregularities. The way it works is it's usually traditionally horsehair, so they're long horse hairs that are stretched. And the way that it gets friction is by being rosined, so some kind of like beeswax rosin makes it sticky, so that when it's dragged over the string or over something else, it actually grabs and pulls the string, kind of like little tiny saw blades. So I wanted to show something different that can be bowed as well, like a cymbal from a drum set. We could bow this cymbal, and by touching in different places, we could activate different partials and kind of hear different notes. So for the final section of the Hornbostel sax system, there's electrophones. So electrophones describe all of the sounds that are created from an electronic source. So that would be all synthesizers, oscillators, computer music, MIDI-controlled digital synthesizers, feedback systems like a microphone feeding back into a room, and so anything that has an electric source. Not really an electric guitar, that's a chordophone that is amplified. So synthesizers like this tiny little monotron analog synthesizer has a little oscillator in it, like we've talked about. It oscillates back and forth and creates a frequency. It has this little sliding key range here. So let's see if I can. Kind of fun. They just make these small little synthesizers so you can play around with the stuff of synthesis, which we'll get into next lesson, and make an music with an electrophone. So as we wrap up here, I just wanted to mention for fun, oddmusic.com. It looks pretty silly, but this is a pretty amazing repository of strange instruments. You can see these are just the latest additions. There's so many strange and fun things in here. The bubble organ, um, and the Uber organ. Look at this. So there's some really fun things that you can find if you're interested in strange instruments. I was very delighted to see this. You can see the Hong drum, um, and yeah, go check it out if you like. This is an artist named Trimpin, um, and this is one of many instruments that he's invented. So if you want to look him up, it's Trimpin. This is called the fire organ, and you can see he's got some pipes where he's putting flame into them, and it's a different way to activate an aerophone. Instead of pumping air in like an organ, this sucks the air using fire. So that wraps it up for today. That's all for lesson 3.1. I hope you enjoyed. It's such a huge topic to try to talk about instruments. There are thousands of instruments from all over the world, and I wanted to give us a sense for some of the basics and some of the types. So as we continue on with Module 3, timbre, we'll be moving on next time to electronic music and sounds.